Hi, this is Marianne from the Corn Wagon, and this is the fourth in our series of Around the Block of the Month from the Corn Wagon. And we'll be doing the block that is the trees and the cloud. So, sorry we can't all meet together again because of this COVID virus thing, but we're hoping that one of these days we'll all be able to meet again. I'm going to be just demonstrating some tips and some helpful hints that might help you with this block. One thing is just follow the directions to cut out the sizes for your backgrounds. And one mistake that I've made several times when I've been making this block is cutting my block so I end up with a selvage on the edge. So the selvage is on this fabric, this art gallery. Maybe it's not art gallery, but it's a beautiful fabric. I've found that the selvages are really wide, and sometimes I forget about that and cut my blocks, and then I have to find another piece of fabric. So just be aware that your selvages are really big and avoid those as you're cutting your blocks out. Now you're going to cut blocks, 4 blocks for the corner. Those are going to be 9.5 inch square. And then you're going to also cut the blocks that will have the trees and the clouds on them. And so cut those out. Now when I first started doing this, I couldn't quite figure out how the 8-inch block ended up being a 9.5 inch block, and I'll show you how that works. The first thing that I would start out doing is making a template with the tree trunk that you have in your pattern. And I've traced it onto the soft fuse and then fused it onto the brown, which will be the tree trunk. And I think she used a little bit different color. I think she says use black, but I thought the brown would be a little bit less harsh, so that's what's in your kit. I would trace these out and put them on. Now you're only going to need 5 of the trunks because one of them will be a cloud, not a tree. So you're going to trace out 5 of the trunks and put them onto your brown wool and cut those out. And I would suggest that you get that fused on there before you do your applique with your cotton fabric. Then you're going to make sure that you don't have to unpick it and tuck those under after you've done the applique. So I've placed this on here, and it looks like it's coming off just a little bit. I'm going to iron it back on just a little bit. Sometimes if you iron from the back of your fabric when you're doing wool, then it'll stick a little bit better if the fusible isn't sticking really well, because sometimes it's hard for your heat to go through the wool piece. Another thing I've done, what I found out is I put the tree on here, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the bottom. When I actually put the whole quilt together, I found that that was way too bulky in the seam, and I ended up picking out the seam and trimming off the tree trunk that was in the seam allowance. So I would just suggest that you leave this seam allowance right here at the bottom without the tree trunk, and then place your tree on there with the fusible. These pieces, this one with the tree is only 8 inches, I think, and the block actually ends up at 9.5. So what you're going to do is I just put it on my mat like this, and then using the template, I cut this out of freezer paper from the top of the tree. This is the top of the tree. And I traced it just like the pattern. Now there's a seam allowance along the top and the sides, and along the bottom edge, I wrote finished edge. And she also has that in the pattern. And the reason I did that is so I remember that I need to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance right there if I'm doing some kind of turning under. if I'm turning that fabric under. So this part right here will all go into the seam, but this you need to applique. So there are many different methods of applique, and what I'm going to do today is show you a different method of applique that you may use when you're doing your trees. Now, some of you have a method of applique that you love, and if you do, use that method, because it doesn't really matter which method you use. I'm just trying to give you some ideas of different methods you can use if you're not really familiar with applique and you're not comfortable with one method or another. So what I've done here is I've used a piece of freezer paper. I've put the pattern, drawn the pattern onto the freezer paper, and then I've ironed it on to the back of my piece of fabric. I've cut along the edge of the paper, and then I've left a 1/4 inch seam allowance along this edge, if you can see it here. So now what I'm going to do is take this pattern, and there's several methods you can use. This is pretty simple curve. It kind of comes in and out like this. So what you will have to do is clip up in these little crotches right here. So I'm gonna clip, all the way to my paper. Don't go beyond the paper. That's the only place that you're really gonna have to clip, is clip your fabric in 1/4 inch in those little crotches right there. There's 4 of them on the cloud or on the tree. And then with the freezer paper, you can actually do it with an iron. You can turn that to the back side of your freezer paper using an iron. And I have an iron here, I don't know if you can see it. So some people find that they can turn the edge right onto the freezer paper and that it works quite nicely. Another method you can use is by using a glue pen. This is a Cell-Line glue pen. So I just put a little bit of glue along the edge of that fabric right there. The little 1/4 inch that's hanging out from the edge. And then with my thumb, I can just press that back onto the paper. The iron can help, or you can just do it without the iron, whichever you feel most comfortable with. So I'll just do a couple of inches at a time. And you don't have to put a ton of glue on there, just enough so it's going to stick. So I put a little bit more glue. Now I'm going to do another couple of inches where I turn that fabric onto the wrong side, making sure I get up into those little crotches there. And some people actually do this with some starch and the iron. I find that doing it with the glue makes it just a little bit more sturdy. So whatever your favorite method is. So I'm going to finish turning this here. It's just this bottom edge that needs to be turned. The rest of it, again, will all go into the seam line. So when I get done, it's ready for applique. All that seam line along there has been turned under. So what Wendy Williams does in her pattern is, this piece right here is only 8 inches, well, 8 inches this way. And it needs to be 9.5 to be the complete block. So what she does, and it's hard to see if I have it down, is she places this applique piece above here, 1.5 inches, and so this becomes 9.5 inches from here to here. So I would just lay it on your mat and then place this, and so it becomes 9.5 inches, and pin it. Let's see, there's 9.5. And I would use my little applique pins if I had them right here, but oops. Is that right? Let's look. 6, 7, 8, 9.5. Okay, gonna move it up. There we go. That looks better, doesn't it, Lori? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm placing the tree part or the green part on top of it like here, and in the back you'll see that the bottom piece or the background piece is actually shorter, and the part of the tree hangs over about 1.5 inches. You can trim this out after you've appliqued it, but I don't think I did on mine. I just left it there. So make sure you get that right before you applicate them along. And another thing that you need to make sure is that this part covers the edges of your wool in the trunk. So now that I have this all ready, then I can go ahead and applique it. I think most of you know a basic applique stitch. If you have any trouble with finding a tutorial or aren't familiar with it, you're basically doing like a little hidden whip stitch around the applique. And I'm sure there's a lot of tutorials. It's pretty hard for me to show it to you with my limited access to great photographer here. But I think that kind of gives you an idea of how it works there. Now, there are 5 different colors for your trees. And then there's one that's gray, and the gray one will be your cloud. It has exactly the same pattern. The only difference is that you're not going to put a tree trunk on it. And when you do your wool applique, instead of putting flowers underneath it, then there's a pattern for little raindrops that will come from the cloud. And all of those will be done with wool applique methods that we've already done before. So you should be fairly familiar with doing those. When I applied my flowers, I actually put together a whole row of the trees. So I put together 3 trees, and then I placed my flowers on the bottom. That was because some of them I actually wanted over the seams as I was going along. I didn't want to just stick within the area right here of each block. And here's the pattern right here. Another thing I did do is when I placed my flowers a lot of the time, and you might see it on the sample, is I kind of grouped them in 3s or 5s. And maybe put a random one here or there. And I really liked the look of that too. So you can place them however you would like. Now the stitch that will be the stem, you can do with a Valdani, and she recommends doing it with just a stem stitch and using a variegated Valdani thread. You could use any kind of green that you prefer. I'm also going to show you how to do the corners, and these corners will also be used with last month's block which had the grass, so it will connect the 2 sides of grass, and the two sides of trees on your pattern. So that's where we're going to use the 9-inch square, 9.5-inch square. And this piece of K-facet fabric is meant to be used for that, for the corner pieces. I love this one, and I love K-facet fabrics. They're always really brightly colored, and they're usually large scale. And I think it's really fun because when you put the template on this one, you kind of get a different part of the pattern. And so each of your corners will look just a little bit different. And I really like that look. So again, what I did is I took some freezer paper and made the template for the corner piece. There's this one, and then there's a little tiny one here. So what I like to do is do it on freezer paper so I can actually take my fabric to the iron and iron the pattern right onto my fabric. Just takes a few seconds for the freezer paper to stick to your fabric. So I've ironed my pattern onto here from the little one. It's too little, I get it lost. I can also put it on here. Again, I have included the seam allowance, and then in these places where I need to add 1/4 of an inch, I've put finished edge, so it reminds me not to cut it right on the line, but to add 1/4 of an inch. So when I get this, I can cut through all 4 layers. I'm gonna need 4 of these. And I can just get my ruler, my rotary cutter, and cut these out. I don't have my rotary cutter. But this is what your pattern will look like right here. Then I would suggest you take this off and iron it to the wrong side of your cutout piece. So I'm going to take my pattern, iron it to the wrong side. I can use the freezer paper over and over several times. It'll still be sticky with iron. So I'm going to be really careful, get it on there correctly with the edge. Okay, so here's my pattern piece with the freezer paper ironed on to the back side. And you can see that there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance still hanging out from the edge right here on this inner circle edge. With this one, because it's an inner circle, I'm going to have to clip it for it to turn correctly. So it's a little bit large. I think I'm going to trim it down so it's just a scant 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to clip it, not heavily, and maybe not all the way to the paper, but about, every 3/4 of an inch. I'm just going to take a little clip into that seam allowance so it'll turn back without buckling. And with this one, you can do it right on the iron. I found that it works quite nicely with this nice just gentle curve. So I've just clipped the seam along here. And then with my iron, and I could use a little bit of starch too, but sometimes steam works just about as well. I'm going to turn that seam back onto the freezer paper. And if it doesn't stick down really well, that one's kind of flopping over, then I can get my glue and just glue it down lightly. It just takes a few minutes with the glue and your fingers to get it nice and smooth. And I also take a little bit of care and make sure it's nice and smooth, just because your applique usually isn't any smoother than the way you turn it, if that makes any sense. If you do needle turn, if you're comfortable with that method. I kind of do a mixture of different methods when I do my applique. So you can see that the pattern has been, I ironed it back and then just glued it down on that back side of the paper. Then I'll take one of my 9.5-inch squares that will be the corner and place it right on here. Now the little tiny piece, I'm going to do the same with it. I'll iron to the back of the piece here. It has the extra 1/4-inch seam along this edge right here. And I've written finished edge on there, so I remember that I needed to add that 1/4-inch seam allowance. So I'm going to do the same. This is just a nice, gentle little curve that I'm going to iron down. And with my glue stick, I can glue it also. So you can see the 1/4-inch seam that I've turned onto the back side of this little piece here. So it's going to go into the opposite corner. So it's going to look like this. And I have a sample of one here of what it will look like. So these will be your 4 corner pieces right here. After I've done this, you can, and it's dried a little bit, you can actually take this paper off. Or you can leave it on and take it out later. It doesn't really matter. In fact, I might just leave it in for a minute and then I can take it off after I've appliqued it down. I've used little applique pins to pin this on here. You can see my little tiny applique pins along here, and maybe just to hold it along. And another thing that a lot of people really like to do is using this glue, which is the glue based it. And I like the little container that has the little accordion pleating thing so you can actually push it out. Some of them don't have that, but I kind of like that one. It has this needle nose end that you can squeeze the glue out of. So what I'm going to do, and I'll do it on this little piece, maybe you can see it a little bit better. So I'm going to put a little fine line along that seam allowance, not on the paper and not on the very edge of the piece, because if you put it on the very edge, it's hard to needle because this glue becomes pretty hard. So where I've put the glue is right along the inside edge of the seam allowance, trying to leave the outer edge without any glue so I can needle it easily. And I'm going to place it on here where it's supposed to go. And that glue will hold it immediately. And then that is ready for me to applique it down. So you can see on this one, if I took out my pins, well, I guess I didn't glue that side. I just glued this one down. So I've glued this one down here, and it's ready to applique anytime I want. So I would do the same along this edge here. I can pull it up. Just put a little bead of glue all along it. And then it's ready for me to applique it down. Now, if you want, you can just leave the needles in there or the little tiny applique pins and applique it that way. So, but the glue kind of is nice because it holds it down there so you're ready to applique. You may also want to notice, and I did kind of try to follow her pattern for where to place the flowers along this little edge, because you're combining the edge, and I don't have the quilt itself here, but you're combining the edge of the grass and the trees. And so some of these come from the bottom and some of them come from the top. So they're coming opposite ways. If you look at the pattern though, that makes sense. So I would look at her guides or her picture as a guide for placing the flowers around these little corners right here. This block actually works up quite easily. The applique is not difficult. I think it teaches you some really nice new techniques for easy applique. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to help you out. But I think you'll really enjoy these trees. They were one of my favorite blocks to do. I would do all of this part of the applique first and then add your wool applique flowers after you've done the fabric applique, and I think that will make it a lot easier for you. So let me know if you have any questions. I hope that we can get together soon so we can show our blocks to one another and see what progress that we've made. But until next time, thanks for joining us for our Around the Corner Block of the Month. See you next time.